this is that task that I was doing to this man.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
so on other side as well. So that's the 20-digit one.
So do I need to provide those papers? Like,
I haven't emailed them to you yet.
we will do it later. Okay, so you will give me a sign when I need to use this,
Yes,
right?
yes. So it'll give you the microphone as well.
Well, I can use that mic.
Oh, sure.
You can clip that all the time. Okay.
That'll be fun.
The front here, front row. Usually people here. We actually started at 9:30.
Yes. I was eating the fruit platter last night. I haven't tried the
Mango steak.
Recording in progress.
Later today. And yeah, the very nice fruit. The grapes were really tasty.
Yeah, they seedless.
Sorry.
Seedless.
Right.
I'm not very sure if they imported from Australia
Oh,
or
right,
from
okay.
China.
Yeah, very tasty.
I hope you enjoy the mango steak and salad.
Okay.
The steak food.
Yep. Just such a beautiful texture on the snake fruit.
Yeah, yeah. You know the mango steak, the bright skin, it's the sauce for medicine.
Okay.
Do you know asam? Asam, what is it in English?
that's okay. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, good morning everyone. Okay, how are you today?
Bagus.
Okay, bagus.
Bagus sekali.
Okay, a very warm welcome to today our guest lecture, hosted as a joint collaboration between ICCLR and Yogyakarta State University. And thank you for all of the attendance for taking the time to meeting in ballroom. We are truly honored to have a very special speaker today with us. That is Associate Professor Paul Kim's PhD from University of Sydney, Australia. So today who will be sharing his expertise on instructional to cognitive load theory and load reduction instruction. Without any further ado, before this, we really welcoming our chief scientist of Indonesian Center for Cognitive Research, Ibu Endah Retnawati, PhD. And we are welcoming. She will be give any opening session first before we jump to mainly sessions. For Ibu Endah Retnawati, go ahead.
Thank you, Nindi. Good morning, everybody. Selamat pagi. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. It's really an honor to have Professor Paul Jeans in this room with us. He is an expert in cognitive flow theory. I've been working with him since 2010, something like that. I started my master's degree in 2006. I worked with John Sweller and Paul Ayers, and my thesis was actually examined by him. That was in about 2008. Then we know each other. I learned so much from his papers, and now we're working on several topics in cognitive flow theory. In specific, we're working on tracing study. It is really a big honor for all of us here to have you here and to have discussions and to listen to your lectures today. Attendance of these lectures are, let me introduce them to you. We have lecturers from mathematics education. We have also lecturers from chemistry educations, physics educations, biology educations, and we have students as well from those areas. We also have one or two lecturers who also in different subjects and would like to know more about cognitive flow theory. Your topic today about introductions of cognitive flow theory and load reductions instructions would be a great assistance for us to start studying cognitive flow theory, to start learning about how we design instructions that help learners to optimize their cognitive process. There are also attendees online, and I'm also thank you for those who are attending online, and hopefully the internet runs smoothly so you can listen to us and watching us from far. So Dr. Paul Jeans, there might be a few numbers of students who are already doing cognitive flow theory research in here, but they're still students. So we need your help for them to gain more understanding about research on cognitive flow theory. We also have lecturers here who spoke with me, like in the past. I cannot really remember when, but they asked me actually how cognitive flow theory developed the principles on reducing cognitive load. I already disseminated to them about my experimental studies and the randomization method that I have applied in the real classrooms, but still I also have obstacle in communicating how actually experiments are done and how we select the methods in designing the groupings at schools. Okay, I think that's for an opening for me. Without further ado, we should invite him to start his talk. I think, Nindi. Once more, thank you very much for everybody for your interest, and I believe that at the end of these lectures, you will gain more understanding on cognitive load theory and how the research on cognitive load reductions are traditionally or usually conducted by the theorists. Once more, I appreciate so much for the preparations. Hopefully you have fun, you enjoy your talk, and hopefully they are very cooperative to you. So please be promised to me that you cooperative to him. Don't be naughty. Just follow his instructions. I thank you very much. Thank you, Nindi. Back to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ibu Enda. It's really warm welcoming for us. Okay, before we start the main session, we want to take a photo first. And how about? Okay. Okay, we need to take a photo first. Yep, group photo.
Where shall I?
In the center.
Okay.
Standing like this.
Sure. Hello. Nice to meet
I
you.
admire you. Admire you.
Oh, right.
Cognitive theory.
Excellent.
Because my dissertation is about cognitive
Ah,
theory,
good.
but in accounting education.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Accounting education.
Wow.
So where are you studying?
Saya rapat dulu nanti jam 10.
Where are you studying?
UGM. UGM.
UGM.
Yeah. Gamification and cognitive theory.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Kita kolaborasi.
There are
Baik, Bapak Ibu dosen, monggo dipersilakan untuk maju ke depan. Bapak Ibu dosen,
Oh iya.
yeah, sure.
Bu Nila tadi udah, Bu Ani, sini aja Bu.
Gaya kognitif load. Enggak ya.
Terima kasih.
Thank you.
That's all right. Okay.
Okay. Without any further ado, let's kick off our first session from Prof. Paulkins. The floor is yours.
Selamat pagi. Thank you so much to Associate Professor Enda Ratnawati for organising my visit. This is my first time in Indonesia. Unlike many Australians, I have not been to Bali, and so I am very much enjoying my time here in Yogyakarta. Learning more about your city, your education system, and your country, your beautiful food, your beautiful clothes. I love batik. And meeting many people, meeting colleagues, meeting students, and helping you learn about cognitive load theory. Miss Enda has been instrumental in building understanding of cognitive load theory in Indonesia. I am tremendously impressed by the work that she does within the higher education system of Indonesia and spreading understanding of cognitive load theory both in higher education and in secondary education in mathematics. I am very hopeful that I can help you learn about the key ideas in cognitive load theory in today's lecture. A brief review. Here are our goals for today's lecture. So, in lecture 1, I will be using some maybe complex terms, maybe some new terms that you have not seen before, but I promise that I will be trying to use suitable educational methods, suitable pedagogy for new learning. I myself, as an educator, have learned many fundamental strategies for managing my students' cognitive load while teaching, and I hope to model those strategies, those pedagogies, during today's lectures. There is a very old saying in psychology, there is nothing so practical as a good theory. Have you heard that one before? There is nothing so practical as a good theory. Sounds like a paradox. Cognitive load theory provides a theory that is practical, where we can apply our understandings of this human cognitive architecture to instruction in many, many different settings. I'll talk more about this term and break it down for you in talking about key educational considerations. Miss Ender has mentioned that in 2025 there was a new policy around in English deep learning that was introduced in Indonesian education. I don't want to talk about all aspects of that new policy, but I do want to suggest that cognitive load theory and a related theory, cognitive theory of multimedia learning, these theories have some very useful ideas to inform responding to the deep learning policy. So I will spend some time in the later part of this first lecture in giving you my thoughts about that policy. And as mentioned, in the second lecture, we will talk about some ideas, some strategies for how we conduct educational experiments. Educational experiments are a very useful, even profound way of generating new knowledge in education. Knowledge that helps us make strong claims that this thing causes this thing. In other words, causal statements. And so it's my favourite kind of educational research and Miss Ender's favourite kind of educational research, and I hope to help you build your understanding about how we conduct high quality educational experiments that produce reliable and valid knowledge about how people learn. I should say, I very much welcome questions while we are going. So please, at any time, just put up your hand and we can talk further. There will be complexity in these lectures. There will be probably terms that you may not have heard before. And so, as we will see, the cognitive load of this lecture will probably be kind of high, and so it's my job as a teacher to help manage that cognitive load to help you learn. So please do put up your hand at any time if you would like to ask questions, okay? Okay, Ender, over to you. She has a task for you.
Baik Bapak Ibu, saya diminta berusaha untuk membacakan dalam bahasa Indonesia supaya lebih mudah. Ini ada semacam simulasi atau percobaan untuk Bapak Ibu. Okay, so just to make sure that I'm doing this correctly,
Yes.
I'll read the digits back
Yes.
in Indonesian,
Yes.
and then they will repeat after me verbally or in writing.
Verbally.
Okay, all. I'll start with this.
Okay.
Siap Bapak Ibu, ada tes. Tidak boleh ditulis, so no writing. No coding or whatever. So it's
Just verbal.
only you listening to me and repeat after me. Jadi hanya mendengarkan saya, kemudian dari apa yang saya sampaikan, Bapak Ibu ucapkan, diulangi. Gitu ya. Perintahnya adalah ulangi apa yang saya sebutkan. Paham? Batuknya nggak sampai ikut ya. Baik, instruksinya adalah ulangi persis angka-angka yang saya sebutkan setelah saya selesai berbicara. Bapak Ibu perlu gitu dulu nggak? Yang pertama, 427 3851 69428 517493 2816574 93521864 3976187 71834418 9352186795 Do you find it struggling when it's getting longer? I'm going to the next one.
Yes.
Or you want to speak first?
So, where are we now?
The second one?
Yep. Let's do a few of those.
Yes. Baik, Bapak Ibu, itu tadi yang tahap pertama. Sekarang yang tahap kedua. Tapi, kalau tadi sesuai dengan urutan yang saya sampaikan, sekarang urutannya dibalik. Jadi kalau saya menyebut 1, 2, Bapak Ibu menyebutnya. Oke. Kalau saya menyebutnya 5, 8, berarti. Oke. Baik, kita mulai ya. 3, 6, 9. 4271 85317 ya po. Coba lagi 295614 minum dulu biar fokus. Satu lagi, dua lagi. 73928846. Ya sudah. Intinya lebih sulit kan ya Bapak Ibu ya.
So, last one.
Okay, one last questions. Satu terakhir. One last questions. Jadi saya akan menyebutkan beberapa angka dan Saya ingin Bapak Ibu menyebutkan kembali secara terbalik. Ya, Bapak Ibu siap? Jadi dibalik ya, nggak urut. Saya akan menyebutkan. Konsentrasi. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Sebutkan. Jadi kalau sudah dikenal sebanyak apapun, tugasnya sulit dibalik pun bisa. Ya kan? Kalau belum kenal, meskipun sedikit, tapi kalau tugasnya sulit, jadi sulit. Okay. I think your task.
Everyone, thank you very much for engaging in that silly exercise. Digit span task is one of the, in fact, it is the oldest standardised test of a cognitive ability called working memory. It dates back to the late 19th century. We did 2 versions of the digit span task: digit span forwards, digit span backwards. Digit span forwards is kind of a good measure of individual variation in storage. But when we shift to digit span backwards, we test something more than storage. We test the people's ability to both store information and manipulate information in our conscious mind. So working memory is more than just short-term memory. Can I just see a show of hands? Have you heard of the phrase or the term short-term memory? Few people? Okay. So short-term memory is kind of the older term that we use for now working memory. When we use terms like these in everyday language, we are referring to a particular part or aspect of our mind, our conscious mind. When we want to pay attention to something, maybe we reduce distractions, maybe we turn off music. For me, maybe I have a good strong cup of coffee. Close the door of my office so that less noise comes in, so that I can focus my attention. As we get older, maybe we ask ourselves this question more. What am I doing? Have we all had this experience of something that I need to do? Okay, I'm going to, in my house, I'm going to go from my office to the kitchen to get a glass of water. So I walk along and my son says to me, "Hey Dad, come and look at this thing that I created." "Oh, okay, let's have a look." "Oh wow, that's amazing. How did you do that? What even is that?" "Oh, that's really beautiful. Amazing. Oh, good on you, son." What did I come in here to do? Oh yeah, glass of water. We are constantly using our conscious mind in order to reach our goals in life. Whether those are small goals or big goals, we are continually using our working memory, and we are also using another part of our mind, our long-term memory. In today's lecture, I'll be talking about both of those parts of the human mind, and collectively we call those human cognitive architecture. The structures and processes of the human mind that explain how we learn and how we solve problems and how we understand the world. On screen here, we have a nice, straightforward definition. Our ability to hold in mind and manipulate information over short periods of time. Just short periods. Coming back to my example of talking with my son, I may have a goal in my mind, but if I am interrupted, then that information fades out of my conscious mind. And so if I am prevented from rehearsing that information in my conscious mind, within less than 20 seconds, that information, that goal, that conscious goal, may have faded out of my mind. So that's without rehearsal. If I can rehearse something, then, I could hold it for hours and hours. If there is a phone number that I want to rehearse, I could just keep on going. 94196725, 94196725, 94196725, until I, fall asleep from exhaustion. That's just rehearsal, though. Rehearsal is a very simple cognitive process. When we learn in places like this, we tend to be using much more complex cognitive processes than just rehearsal. Rehearsal is important, but as we will see, there are higher order cognitive processes that we use our working memory for, and that we as educators should be supporting and deliberately encouraging our students to use. So more on that in good time. Oh, I should say, I will be giving these slides to Miss Ender later on today, this lecture and the next lecture, and so she will pass them on to you. So in many of the slides, there will be hyperlinks so that you can access these resources. I think most of them are open access, open source, so they're not, I think most of them are not behind a paywall. Some of them will be for purchase, like textbooks, but this one, for example, completely free. Okay, so good resources to have. Okay. This thing called human cognitive architecture. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the processes and structures that it is made up of. What does this mean? Does it mean anything? This graffiti that we might see on the street, what does it mean to you? Life is art. Does it make you think? Does it make you feel something? Do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? Does it make you angry that someone has done some graffiti? All of this is happening in your working memory, in your conscious mind. So if we go a little bit deeper about how you are processing some aspects of this information, let's just focus on one part. This. For people who use the Roman alphabet, like people who speak English, people who speak Bahasa Indonesia, we recognise A as a meaningful unit of information. It is not simply random pieces of information. It is more. Because we have information related to this in what's called our long-term memory, we recognise this as a meaningful unit of information. The first stage of information processing is called perception. That is very, very fast and subconscious when we have knowledge. We very quickly do an analysis of the elements of this thing. But because, as we can see here, because we have knowledge in long-term memory, we are what is called primed to recognise that information. And using this model of human cognitive architecture, I'm borrowing from a researcher called Nelson Cowan, when we focus, we recognise this single letter. We can all do more than focus on just a single letter. When we look at that, we see all of it. Life is art. We process that information very, very quickly, and then we start using higher order cognitive processes related to our knowledge, related to our critical thinking, maybe our creative thinking, maybe using our emotional reactions. Who has children? Can I see? Who has children? A few people? Okay. Think about what they go through when they are just learning to read. For them, they have to read each element one by one. L, I, F, C? Is that a C, Daddy? And you might think, no, actually it's an E. Life? That's right. Is, yes, is. But maybe they don't know what that word is means. Art. When we learn, when we have knowledge, in our long-term memories, the situation changes enormously for making meaning of our environment, of the lessons that we face, of the things that we read, of the conversations that we have. And so that idea of human cognitive architecture, changing how we process information, is at the heart of cognitive load theory. And so it's my job today to really sort of build on that basic idea. that knowledge of how the human mind works can be very, very powerful for us as educators, because it will change what we expect of our students. It will change how we teach. It will change how we think people should learn. That's another aspect. So many, many changes, many, many different ways of thinking about education flow from this way of thinking about instruction. Can I just pause here and invite any questions that you might have about this model?
Silakan Bapak Ibu jika ada pertanyaan tentang penjelasan baru saja.
Okay.
Okay, you all okay? Are you okay? Okay.
I'll be coming back to these ideas throughout the lecture, so revisiting, working memory versus long-term memory. So let's talk about one of the theories that cognitive load theory uses is called schema theory. Schema is an ancient word from ancient Greece. We can translate it basically as pattern. And in a very real sense, when we think successfully, we are recognising patterns that we already know, that we already have encoded in our long-term memories. So just to give one more example, or an example we've already seen, when we read, we are recognising patterns. In this case, visual patterns. Patterns that we already know. To give you an example, on Friday, or was it Saturday? Saturday when I arrived in Yogya, Hilda and Lindy were driving me from the train station. I was looking around, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Many things are familiar to me. People, houses, telegraph poles, many things that are familiar to a Westerner, but many things that are not familiar to a Westerner. And do you remember what I pointed out? So, going to put you on the spot. Do you remember what I asked you about? Memorial?
Oh, memorial. Yeah.
Sorry, I put you on the spot. Maybe you don't remember. We passed by a monument that had written language on it. And I thought, I don't recognise that written language. I'm used to seeing Bahasa Indonesia in Roman letters. And I asked, is that Javanese? Is that the older written language that was used in your country? And I thought, and I made the comment, it reminds me of Thai, the Thai language. So can you see, I'm recognising a pattern. I'm not understanding the pattern because obviously I don't understand Javanese and I don't understand Thai, but I am recognising a pattern. So I want you to remember that very important idea at the heart of how our minds work, that we are constantly recognising patterns. We are constantly trying to make sense of our environment using the knowledge that we already have. Sometimes that knowledge will be very, very useful in making sense. Sometimes we have very extensive knowledge that we can use to make sense of our environment and of other people, but sometimes we don't. My understanding of Bahasa Indonesia is very, very little. Very little. I love the sound of Bahasa Indonesia. I've been saying to some people, it reminds me of drumming. It is a very, to my ear, I recognise a pattern, very rhythmic, and I love it because I used to drum. I'm drawing on my knowledge, my experience in recognising a pattern. So schemas are basically patterns. It is a theory of how we encode knowledge in our long-term memory. I'm just going to pause, well, I'm going to be quiet and invite you to read. I won't read this out. You read this and make sense. Okay, so this basic definition of schemas gives us a sense of a type of knowledge that we have encoded in our long-term memory, and this knowledge, these knowledge patterns, play a vital role in all parts of thinking. Technical term, cognition. Recognising things, manipulating information in working memory, and learning. So all parts of cognition, including cognition that is related to education. So schema theory provides one of the sub-theories of cognitive load theory. So by that analysis, a few things follow. Cognitive load theory defines learning in terms of schemas. Cognitive load theory argues that when we learn, that is another way of saying that we are constructing schemas in our long-term memory. So our long-term memory has changed as a result of learning. If we have not constructed some new schema, then in a fundamental way, we have not learned. So schema construction is one process that cognitive load theory talks about, and there's a second one, automation. Can I ask, who drives a car? Who drives a car? Not many? Okay. Who rides a scooter? Okay. Or even just a bicycle? Okay. Scooters, bicycles. So many of us have experience with this relatively complex task. Think for yourselves, what was it like when you were first learning to ride a bicycle or then a scooter? Very, very difficult. Many, many things to think about. Think about riding in the traffic. Huge amount of information coming into your mind at all times. kind of dangerous if you don't know what you are doing. But with practice, that changes. What used to take a lot of thinking no longer takes so much conscious thinking. You just do things automatically. Let me give you another example. Have you ever had this experience when you want to go from your home to work, get on your scooter or in your car and you travel, and you get to that place and you think, what just happened? You have been riding or driving on autopilot, yes? So all of that information, all of those things that you were doing, lane changes, making sure you don't fall off your bike, all of that happens automatically, yes? That's one of the best examples that I can give of schema automation through practice. So first schema construction, then schema automation through practice. Doesn't happen immediately. But when we have automated schemas, we don't experience so much load on our working memory. I'll talk more about load, cognitive load, shortly. So a second principle follows from this, that if we want to become an expert in a specific domain, like mathematics, chemistry, English, psychology, whatever domain you want to talk about, riding a scooter, to become an expert is essentially to construct and automate a large number of schemas, of interconnected schemas in your long-term memory. So think about what all of us have done in our lives. We have all gone through many, many years of education, and we have learned to read and to write and to solve problems in our domains of expertise. Under this analysis, we are experts because we have learned many, many, many things, many, many schemas. What is easy for us is not easy for novices. Because of the schemas that we have, the patterns that we can recognise, that has changed how easily we can think and solve problems in our domains. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I just want to make sure that relating to the schema, is it correct that the schema that has been formed in each person is different, right? It is based on the prior knowledge of that has been stored in their long-term memory. Is it correct? Okay, so in the context of teaching learning process, it is important that we know the prior knowledge of the students before we start the lessons, something like that?
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So it is absolutely ideal if we have some working model of the student and their prior knowledge. Maybe even other things like their motivations, that would also be nice, but certainly if we have a working understanding, even a relatively simple one, of the likely prior knowledge that students have, and that's where, and look, we're all experienced educators and my apologies if I'm stating stuff that you already know, but sometimes it's useful to emphasise things. Part of the use of assessment is to actually understand where our students are, so diagnostic assessment. And that's another way of saying, what schemas do my students already have? What gaps in knowledge might they have? If they have gaps in knowledge, it would be a mistake to proceed because they just won't understand. And remedial education focused on those gaps would be suitable at that point. Thank you. Yep. Okay, so just to emphasise everyone, I've talked about working memory and long-term memory, but it's easy to separate them, but that would be a bit of a mistake because as this diagram shows, we are constantly using both types of memory. Information, or rather knowledge, schemas from long-term memory we are constantly activating them into our working memory. So I've got an example here. Apologies that the writing is a little bit unclear. So imagine hearing some words. So these words come from an actual lesson that researchers observed. So what the person is saying is, it's lichens, little yellow lichens. Now, that's the only growing thing we found in Antarctica to find living plant life, lichens. So this sounds like an everyday conversation, right? What's happening in this person's mind while they're learning? Well, schemas in long-term memory are being activated or represented in working memory. So we've got lichens, growing, I'm not sure what MC stands for, apologies, Antarctica, living, plant. These are all schemas in long-term memory that are becoming activated at the same time in our conscious mind. And when that happens, when people think carefully about multiple schemas active in working memory, something magical happens. Learning. We construct a new schema, combining all of those active schemas. Graham Nuthall and his colleagues, Nuthall was a New Zealand educational researcher doing amazing classroom observation-based research. The conclusion he and his team reached was that we need multiple experiences of the same information, separated by not too long a period of time, to really, really create that new schema. So multiple opportunities to practice constructing and automating that new schema based on multiple representations held in working memory. Okay, yes.
Can you display the previous slide? Is that the statement true for all cases? Because I think there are many experiences that happen only once, but for somebody or someone maybe it can be memorized forever. So it's only one experience, but memorized forever.
So that's a good challenge. sometimes it seems like we have multiple experiences. Sorry, we have only one experience, but we learn. Sorry, I'll go back to the previous slide. So this body of research suggested that we need 3 to 4 experiences. I would suggest that this body of research relates to perhaps more complex parts of the curriculum and perhaps more, single experiences, maybe relatively simple ones. Relatively simple things to be learned. I wonder whether sometimes when it feels like we only have one experience, there are actually perhaps multiple experiences going on in our mind. Let me give you an example. When I'm trying to learn new phrases or new words in Bahasa Indonesia, almost never do I find just one practicing once has got the word right for me. Normally I have to practice it multiple times in my mind, might close my eyes. This morning it was Selamat Pagi, and I had to really think very carefully about it. Now, I think I've got it, Selamat Pagi. So it's, it sort of depends on how you define an experience. Was it just today is the experience, or is it multiple experiences in my own mind? So I hope that gives you some sort of, response to, it's a good question. Sometimes it feels like we do learn things very quickly. And maybe, to be fair, maybe some students learn more quickly than others. Maybe some students have a higher level of what we call general cognitive ability that might explain differences in rate of learning. But that's outside, in a sense, that's outside the scope of cognitive load theory. Okay. So, cognitive load theory evolves or revolves around human cognitive architecture. Its goal is to take what we know about the human mind, the differences between working memory and long-term memory, and design instructional events and instructional materials that are optimised for the strengths and limitations of the human mind, of human cognitive architecture. The theory was initially developed by Professor John Sweller of University of New South Wales. So Ender's PhD supervisor, my PhD supervisor, fantastic scientist. A scientist actually. And so beginning in the 1980s, started developing the theory, and it has grown internationally so that there is an extended community of researchers in many different countries, including Indonesia, who are contributing to the theory and continuing to grow it and test its ideas. So what is this thing called cognitive load? I've been using it a little bit here and there, and on screen we see a definition. The load imposed on working memory by the cognitive processes that a task demands. So coming back to the task that we started with, digit span. Some parts of digit span that you experienced were much higher cognitive load than others. So when Enda was reading out a large number of numbers backwards, would you agree? High cognitive load? Yeah? Just a, 2 or 3 numbers, low cognitive load. But the last task that you did, when she read out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way to 20, and then you had to say it backwards, something strange happened, I think. That objectively, a large number of numbers, many more than what she had read out before, but you were able to do it easily because of the schemas that you had in your long-term memory. The schema that you had for the number line and the schema that you had for reversal allowed you to do that task very, very easily, I would say. I didn't see anyone in the room who was going, oh no, I can't do it. Easy. A demonstration of the power of knowledge, the power of schemas to fundamentally change processing in working memory. Your expert schemas in this case changed the cognitive load that you were experiencing. And this happens all the time. The schemas that we have, the patterns that we can recognise, change how we process information. Just checking, we're going for 1 more hour? Yep, okay, I better speed up. Quite a lot. Let's give some examples. I need to start building in some additional theoretical terms. Cognitive load theory distinguishes between 2 fundamentally different sources of cognitive load. The first one is called intrinsic cognitive load. The task itself, the load intrinsic to the task itself. Can I see, where are science educators? Chemistry education? Chemistry education? Okay, a few people. So here's an example for you. So imagine that a student thinks, I want to learn all of the terms for the periodic table. In a sense, that's difficult because there's many, many of them. But in another sense, it's easy because you are only relating 2 things at a time. I don't have to understand this relationship in order to understand this relationship. The elements only interact to a very small degree. So just 2 elements that I need to think consciously about in order to construct that new schema. Same goes for languages. If I want to learn I wanted to learn hello. It's one of the first things I learned in Bahasa Indonesia. So I look at a book and it says salam. Okay, I can learn that. Salam, 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 salam. And then I move on to something else. So vocabulary is an example of low intrinsic load task. but many, many things that we need to learn are higher in intrinsic load. As an example of low intrinsic load, if I asked you what day of the week is tomorrow, what day of the week is tomorrow? Okay, how hard, how difficult was this task on a scale of sangat mudah to sangat sulit? How hard? 1? Okay. Low intrinsic cognitive load because of low element interactivity. Many tasks that we face, much more complicated. So when we talk about grammar and syntax, we are having to understand many things interacting at the same time. Here we see a sentence in English and all of the interrelationships under a linguistics analysis. It's complicated when we talk about grammar and syntax. Another example from John Sweller. This one's a bit evil. Suppose 5 days after the day before yesterday is Friday, what day of the week is tomorrow? I promise you, I don't know. I would need a piece of paper to manage my cognitive load, to figure that out. It's called cognitive offloading. It's one of the main reasons we invented writing, to help us learn complex things. So, sangat mudah, sangat sulit, where on the scale? Yes? Maybe somewhere over here. Okay, so high intrinsic cognitive load because of high element interactivity. Another example. So which one will fill up first? Again, I don't know. I'd have to wait until it finishes. But what we have here is a complex system with interacting elements. And for, I would say, all of us working in advanced education, think about what we are asking our students to do. We are asking them to understand and learn complex information. So most of the curriculum is going to be high element interactivity for our students. And so the job for us as teachers is to help manage our students' cognitive load. Okay, so through this part of the lecture, I want to actually, before we go on to this, let's have a little break. So can I encourage you all to stand up? Okay, stretching. Okay, there we go. Okay, maybe a little, if you want. So please sit down. Everyone, this is something that I do in my own lectures because our working memories get a bit exhausted, get depleted. And in recent years, cognitive load theory has investigated this working memory depletion effect. And so if we take little rest breaks, brain breaks is another word that is used in primary and secondary education, we can refresh our students
and help them learn better than if we don't take some quick breaks. Okay. Let's talk quickly about a couple of educational implications that follow from focusing on cognitive architecture. So the first one, overlearning or automating key elements in isolation. If we help students construct and automate key schemas, then that will lower the cognitive load that they experience with high element interactivity tasks. So overlearning, or as Richard Mayer calls it, pre-training. Imagine a complex system like this, like a brake system. The idea here would be that we have a separate part of the lesson before learning everything as a whole, that we encourage them or provide them with an opportunity to overlearn or automate individual parts of the system before understanding the system as a whole. So the pre-training principle is a very useful task. There is another source of cognitive load that's different to intrinsic cognitive load, and that's called extraneous cognitive load. Definition is up the top here. Extraneous cognitive load comes from when we ask our students to engage in processing that doesn't involve schema construction or automation. We'll see some examples in a moment, but I just wanted to emphasise, why do we need to know about these two different sources of cognitive load? Well, if we think about our working memory capacity, it's limited. Our working memory capacity is limited, and perhaps the combination of intrinsic load and extraneous load is still within our working memory capacity. But sometimes it might not be. Maybe the task itself, the processing requirements of the task itself is this much, so intrinsic load is very high, and maybe there's also a lot of extraneous cognitive load. And then we've got, you can see here, there's a difference here. They're overloaded. Perhaps an example at this point. Imagine the student is trying to understand some complex scientific argument, and their younger brother is playing a video game in the room next door. This happens in my household. My son plays video games and sometimes he gets very excited. And so he'll be yelling out with his friends. And even with the door closed, I can still hear him and I find it distracting. So I have high intrinsic cognitive load, but I am also processing information, my son's voice, and that's unrelated to what I'm trying to learn about. And it's overloading my working memory. So what are we to do? Well, whenever possible, we should think carefully about the design of our instructions, our learning materials, our learning activities, and try and reduce as much as possible the extraneous cognitive load so that it's within our cognitive capacity. That's the basic argument. So intrinsic load and extraneous load add up together. And if the two of them together are more than our working memory capacity, we have cognitive overload. And that's a problem for learning. Okay. So what are we to do? There are a number of strategies that we can use. So first one is very, very general. And it kind of relates to your question earlier on about assessment. Figuring out what the learners already know and tailoring instruction appropriately. Cognitive load theory emphasises very much the idea of a great deal of support for students when they are novices, and argues against the use of problem solving for learning, pure problem solving. One way that we can provide a high level of support for novices in a given domain is through the idea of worked examples. And we see some definitions of worked examples on screen here. I'll just be quiet for a moment and let you read what's on screen. At this point in your lives, as students and educators, I'm guessing that you have seen hundreds, if not thousands, of worked examples. They're very common. Sometimes they're very well designed, sometimes they could be improved. So, cognitive load theory has investigated quite a few different ways in which we can optimise the design of worked examples. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. As an example of a worked example from high school mathematics. This one is now decades old. It comes from my PhD. I've used this one multiple times. So a worked example shows how an expert would solve a problem from beginning to end. That's how I define a worked example. A good worked example shows how an expert would solve a problem from beginning to end. In a way, a worked example is an external representation of an expert's schema. Look, sometimes there are problems with worked example design that cause extraneous cognitive load. And we see one such problematic worked example on screen here. When I was in high school, back in the 1980s, it would be very common for worked examples to be represented like this. So nice and neat diagram, nice and neat text. But the problem here is what's called split attention. In order to make sense of the whole worked example, I'm constantly having to look back and forth between the text and the diagram. That looking back and forth happens before schema construction and automation. It's extraneous to schema construction and automation. And so early cognitive load theory research suggested a different design, an integrated design. So wherever possible, try and integrate text into the diagrams. And look, this might seem very obvious now, very obvious, and that's fair. Many, many textbooks now don't make this mistake. This idea has been around for quite a few years now. And so, as a field, educators are not so often making this mistake, which is great. Kind of related to the split attention effect is signalling. Sometimes we can help guide people's attention through clear signals. Two ways of doing that. Colour coding. So it makes it very clear, the learner can see very quickly what they need to focus on. Arrows are another way of doing that. And we see arrows in these diagrams. These are very easy now to do it. And look, just as a side note, when you lecture, you might find yourself noticing how often do you use your finger to point, yes? What you're doing is guiding attention for your students. You may have noticed already, I use my hands a lot to guide attention and also for gestures more broadly. That is very deliberate. My goal is to help people understand and to focus attention. And I find gestures to be useful for that purpose. Look, it helps that I'm an extrovert. Okay, I enjoy teaching. But I'm making that suggestion that if you're a little bit sort of static in your educational style, maybe try moving a bit more, guiding people's attention, drawing pictures in the air when you're talking. Okay. One of the next strategies that was investigated in cognitive load theory is called the redundancy effect. Often we provide extra information because we think it will help people learn. Great example. Have you ever been to a conference where people put all of the text up on screen and then they read out all of the text? People seen that happen? I've seen it happen a couple of times. Bad idea. Because the information here and the information they are speaking is redundant. People listening need to simultaneously listen and follow along, and that's really hard. It will overload their working memory. So, big idea for lecturers. Look, sometimes it is a good idea to have a lot of text on screen, but if you do want to do that, don't read it all out. Just say, okay, I'll be quiet for a moment and let you read through this. Easy. You don't need to speak it out. Sometimes a little bit of redundancy can be helpful. So, an idea from Richard Mayer, a lesson on how lightning storms work. So we see the audio channel, cool moist air moves over a warmer surface and becomes heated, and there's a little redundancy. in the text here, just a little. And that helps retention. Maybe not transfer, but just retention. So a little bit helpful, just a little bit of redundancy. In classrooms, there is a clear educational implication. Many, many classrooms look like this. Many teachers think that this is a good idea because it makes the classroom very welcoming, maybe very personal. I understand why they might do that, but from a cognitive processing perspective, there can be problems. Students, particularly some students, who might have ADHD, may find this very, very distracting. And so in an experiment from 2014, these researchers found that taking many of these decorations out actually resulted in less distraction, students being less off task, and making bigger learning gains. Kind of counterintuitive. Okay. Another idea for your lecturing. It is very important to remember that what we speak doesn't last in our working memory. If I put stuff up on screen here, it lasts until I go like that. But spoken speech fades out of our working memory unless we rehearse it. It is transient. And so we need to pay a lot of attention in how we speak while we teach. You've probably noticed at this point that I speak slowly and that I kind of have pauses in my sentences. I do that with every audience. I learnt that from John Sweller and my PhD co-supervisor, Paul Chandler, in how they lectured. I do that in order to manage cognitive load of my audience. Hopefully it helps. You may have noticed that I use my hands. I also emphasise things. All of this is to help manage communication and cognitive load for transient information, spoken information. This is particularly important with much younger students or with students who don't know much about the field. Some important research was done about this in Australia, and I expect the same kinds of patterns would be found around the world. This research by Ken and Kathy Rowe and Pollard examined how easily students understood spoken sentences. So imagine a sentence of 8 words versus up to 12 words. So reading through this table, in any given classroom that they investigated, up to 20% of students would have difficulty with a sentence longer than just 8 words. Just think about that. 20% of kids in a classroom would struggle with a sentence longer than 8 words. And it's not much better as kids get older. They investigated primary school children, so children of around 9 to 10 years old. About 20% of kids children struggled with sentences longer than 12 words. That's not much. And so there's many important teaching implications that follow from that. The main one is speaking slowly and chunking information. And I would add to that gesturing, because it helps people understand what you're saying. Sorry, my strategies are my numbering is out of order. So much of cognitive load theory has focused on novices, but we don't stay a novice forever. We grow in our expertise. We develop a larger and more well-organised collection or network of schemas. And so that begs an important question. What do we do as people become more expert? That led to important research led by Slava Kuliah on the expertise reversal effect. Classic study from the expertise reversal effect. I just want to talk it through. So, two groups of students learning about electrical engineering ideas. They all start as novices. One group learns mainly through worked examples, and the other group learns through exploring problems in electrical engineering. So that's the first phase. And both groups get measured on the same set of variables. Both groups then receive additional training. 1 hour of training, a second hour of training. So they are growing in their schemas. More instruction following this initial instruction. So everyone gets the same instruction in the middle here. And then a second phase. Again, learning through worked examples versus learning through exploring. So they've started out as novices, but they've become more expert over time. Something very interesting happened. We see a crossover in the effectiveness of instruction. Worked examples were more effective at the starting point of instruction when students were novices. But as students became more expert, the situation changes. There's a reversal. Students who explored became more effective in their learning. Students who studied worked examples became less effective in their learning. So this is enormously important. Cognitive load theory doesn't say worked examples are the best way of helping students learn in all circumstances. It depends. It depends on prior knowledge, on schemas in long-term memory. If we have more expert learners, we should adapt our instruction. Provide less structure. Let students figure it out themselves. But if we have novice students and we just expect them to learn by themselves through problem solving, there's a phrase in English, throwing students into the deep end of the pool. Does that translate well, Enda? Throwing students into the deep end of the pool? Do you want to try and translate?
Kalau di tempat kita itu kan ada deep learning ya Bapak Ibu ya, pembelajaran mendalam. Maksudnya gitu, jadi langkah-langkah untuk mempelajari sesuai dengan tingkatan pengetahuan awal supaya membantu siswa bisa mempelajari dengan lebih mendalam.
Yeah, thank you.
Trying
try. Look, Australians love swimming. So if we throw students into the deep end of the pool, we're expecting them to learn through working it out themselves. And sometimes that's really not a good idea. So the expertise reversal effect is a very, very important boundary condition in the theory, that depending on students' prior knowledge, we should adapt our instruction suitably, moving from higher levels of structure to lower levels of structure. In the theory of education more generally, there is a very, very long-standing debate between kind of two sides. I'm simplifying, but two sides. People who advocate for more sort of problem-based learning, exploratory learning. We often refer to them as people who advocate for constructivism, compared to people who advocate for explicit instruction. It's a very, very long-standing debate, and it's, I don't know, I'm a little bit sick of hearing of it, frankly, because I think we need to do both. Ideas from both sides have their place, depending on the prior knowledge that students have. And so my colleague from University of New South Wales, Andrew Martin, has developed a framework built on cognitive load theory that tries to bring in the best ideas from both sides of this debate, called load reduction instruction. I'll just be quiet for a moment and let you read through what's on screen here. So in other words, it depends. How should we help students learn? It depends. It depends on what stage of learning they are at, how much relevant prior knowledge they have. Right at the start, when people are novices, we should be focusing on difficulty reduction and support and scaffolding, using things like worked examples or templates or modelling. When we model an idea or a process, when we talk it through, we are acting like a worked example for our students. We are making our expert thinking visible, and that's important. We need to provide people with practice. Practice opportunities are important for automating schemas. Practice can be physical, practice can also be mental. And you might use it yourself when you perhaps close your eyes and try to imagine the steps in a worked example or some other process. Can I ask, do any of you play sports? Any sporting people?
Bapak Ibu olahraganya apa?
Okay. So,
Sepak bola, tenis.
tennis? Okay. So the reason that I ask is that mental practice, also called mental rehearsal, also called visualization or imagination, very, very common in sports, in professional sports. probably quite underused in education. It's very, very simple to do, but we need to help people construct a schema first that they can then imagine. And that was the topic of my PhD. So very simple, just closing your eyes and imagining the steps in a worked example. Once we've gone through these phases, we need to provide students both feedback on their qualities of their performance and also feed forward, setting goals for where to from here. Ultimately, leading to more independent learning. Students setting their own goals, solving their own problems. For those of us who supervise PhD students or master's students, there is a great deal of independent learning operating at that level, and that's how it should be. That we don't do everything for our students because we need to give them opportunities to know what it is like to be independent problem solvers. But if we did that right at the start, that would be too difficult. On the screen here, we see a range of pedagogies that are associated with different stages. And in case you're wondering, what are these, guys? These are how we might measure different stages of load reduction instruction with our students. How would they respond? Would they strongly disagree that this happens in my class, or would they strongly agree? So from the student perspective, what would this look like? Again, I'll be quiet, let you have a quick read through. Okay, so load reduction instruction is built on cognitive load theory, but in an important way it goes beyond cognitive load theory to think about the particular strategies, the teaching strategies, the pedagogies that we might use at different points in a learner's journey, all of which are going to optimise cognitive load, are going to optimise schema construction and automation, while also supporting student motivation. One of the features of Andrew Martin's work is that he started off as a motivation researcher, a very, very good one, and he is very interested in how cognition and motivation interrelate. So I hope that I have made you more interested in his work, because I think it is cutting edge as a new development related to cognitive load. Okay. I've translated here something from the introduction to the new deep learning policy. I'll just be quiet for a moment, let you have a read through. the policy has a number of very higher order goals, as I understand it. It aims to help Indonesian educators think more carefully about the quality of learning outcomes, and the assessment strategies that are used in reaching those learning outcomes. And many of these ideas are very, very similar to policy documents in Australia and in other countries. So when I was reading it through, I thought, yes, this is familiar. Unfortunately, there are a number of bodies of educational research that can guide Indonesian educators in thinking carefully about meeting the requirements of this. And so I just want to give you a few thoughts about these bodies of scholarship. I've talked about Professor John Sweller as a leading Australian educational researcher, and my other favourite Australian educational researcher is this man, John Biggs, who is now retired. I never had the honour of meeting him, but I've certainly used a lot of his work over my life and in my teaching. Just a quick summary of some of his key ideas. Biggs was very famous for what's called a process model of education, the 3P model, emphasising these variables: presage, process and product. It is a theoretical model that helps us think strategically and holistically about educational systems like schools or universities, or possibly even classrooms. Thinking about what are the different types of variables and what are the qualities of those different variables that ultimately affect learning. So I'm going to put up a complex model, but don't get frightened. I want to try and simplify this model somewhat. We have presage variables, both student presage variables, all of the aspects of a student that they bring to learning. That can include socioeconomic status, can include their prior knowledge, can include their personalities, can include many things. That's on the student side. But also, it's important to understand and be aware of the teaching context. So that's the teaching side. There are many aspects of a teaching situation like this. What the teacher does, their experiences, the curriculum, educational policies, but also assessment. And I've highlighted assessment very deliberately. Imagine this situation. If you go into a classroom and you say to a student, what do you think of the curriculum in your school? In most Australian classrooms, students would just look at you and go, the what? What's a curriculum? Maybe they'd understand a bit better the word syllabus, maybe not. It's just not a meaningful word for many students. But if you changed one word, what do you think of the assessment tasks in this classroom or in this school? Students will have a much stronger set of opinions. Assessment is very visible to students. They may have very strong opinions about assessment. assessment drives learning in a very visible way. And so I guess that's part of the reason why policymakers in Indonesia have focused on deep assessment, because it matters. It drives learning decisions and study decisions by students. These characteristics of a learning system together drive how people learn. Biggs talks about meta-learning. It's kind of a variation on metacognition, our awareness of why we study in the way that we do. And he makes a distinction between deep approaches to learning versus surface approaches to learning. And the policy document aims to help Indonesian educators think more carefully about how can we shift people towards deep approaches to learning and away from surface approaches to learning. Ultimately, to improve learning outcomes. That's the overall goal. Learning outcomes can take different forms. They might take the obvious forms of assessment tasks, but they may also take different forms about how people feel, the emotions that they feel about learning. Are they interested in school? Do they enjoy being at school? Imagine this as a learning outcome, that a student finishes school and they think to themselves, I never want to study again. That would be a terrible learning outcome. A bad learning outcome compared to a student who finishes school and thinks, I can't wait to go to UNY. I'm really looking forward to learning more. That's a different kind of learning outcome, but an important one. So learning outcomes can take different forms. So, another idea that Biggs is famous for goes under the title of constructive alignment. In other countries, in America, it's kind of a similar idea called backwards mapping that you might have heard of. Backwards mapping, where we start with the learning outcomes and then we think carefully about the teaching and learning activities and the assessment tasks that we use. I'm seeing some nodding, so similar kinds of ideas. All of those things, all of these need to work together in our planning at every level of education. If we don't give enough thought to constructive alignment, Biggs argues then we may achieve lower level learning outcomes than we want. If, for instance, our assessment tasks are not suitable for the learning outcomes that we want, then students will basically do as little as they want, as little as they might want to, just to pass. What he calls backwash. The system will be driven by backwash from testing, not by the curriculum. So all of these different elements need to work together. Biggs is also famous for this taxonomy of learning outcomes. This taxonomy is mentioned in one of the appendices of the policy, the Solo taxonomy. It distinguishes between different levels of understanding. It's okay to have a learning outcome at this level when this may be really important. But very often, we want more from our students. We want them to be able to explain things or describe or interpret. We may want higher level learning outcomes such as these. Or at the highest level, such as PhD, we may want this. Sorry. We may also want this in sometimes of high school or even primary school. We might be able to develop suitable assessment tasks even for younger students and with suitable development of relevant prior knowledge. Maybe younger children can do this too. But if we don't use assessment tasks with these appropriate learning outcomes, then it'll be very surprising if students do the cognitive work to actually achieve those higher level learning outcomes. We need to align our learning outcomes with our teaching and learning activities and our assessment tasks. That's the fundamental argument that Biggs is making, and also the policy document is making. So just some final thoughts about what does a cognitive perspective on this look like. I'm going to draw on the work of Richard Mayer from University of California, San Diego. Richard Mayer is famous for his cognitive theory of multimedia learning, and it's got a lot of similarities to cognitive load theory. I call it a cousin theory. He distinguishes between three different types of cognitive processing: extraneous processing, like extraneous load; essential processing, like intrinsic load; but something a bit different: generative processing, making sense of what it is that we are learning, reorganising it in terms of prior knowledge. What does that look like from a process model? It's like this. When we learn from multimedia, and we are constantly learning from multimedia, information comes mainly through words and pictures, processed quickly, perceived by the ears and the eyes. We need to select words and images. We need to organise those into an integrated understanding. And then we need to integrate that with our prior knowledge. And so generative processing operates around this stage. So what can we do? What strategies can we use for generative processing? Well, there are a couple that we know quite a lot about, that are quite effective in a range of different educational settings. And maybe you use these with your students already. We can understand them in terms of generative processing. Things like summarising or testing ourselves. Can I see, do people use concept mapping at all? Maybe? Explaining things to yourselves, putting things in your own words. This one, probably not used very much, but I'm very fond of it because it is embodied. It is much more active than just sort of, sitting down. So I've mentioned these as a range of more active learning strategies, and these are examples of what I would call strategies that will result in deep learning, in more sense making, coming back to where we started. We are constantly trying to make sense of the world, and high quality learning involves making sense of what is being learned rather than rote learning. So if you're looking for to help students learn to learn better, learn to learn more effectively, these are some of the strategies that I would suggest. Building into lessons, helping students learn how to learn. We're nearly finished, everyone, but I just wanted to emphasise that cognitive load theory and load reduction instruction is sometimes criticised for orienting towards rote learning, and that's not really true. Load reduction instruction in particular makes the argument that we can and should be aiming to support creative and deep learning, creative capabilities, but it depends when we do that. And so, under the argument that Andrew Martin was developing, we need to provide students with a lot of opportunity to develop an extended body of knowledge, an extended schema base, and that will be the basis for independent and creative work. If we don't help students develop that knowledge base, it will be very difficult for them to be creative. In other words, oh, that's a shame, I've missed out a slide. There is a lovely phrase from Carl Hendrick: you can't connect the dots if you don't have any dots. You can't be creative about something if you don't have the schemas to mix and match and create something new. Everyone, I've provided a couple of suggested readings. So these are all websites or open access documents. Andrew Martin has an amazing website with a range of different downloadable documents for a range of different... He's been developing these for several decades now. Strongly recommend you check these out because they are oriented towards students, towards teachers. Documents that teachers can use. And John Biggs, this is probably the classic textbook, and a New Zealand colleague called Pam Hook has developed a range of resources consistent with the Solo taxonomy and constructive alignment, oriented towards school use. So if you're looking for resources that are suitable for teachers to use in schools, I would suggest those are the best starting points. And if you're looking to learn more about the Solo taxonomy, this is an interview with Pam Hook that I can recommend. Okay, well, I think we need to finish, so I'll stop there. Can I invite any questions?
Silakan Bapak Ibu, apakah ada yang mau menyampaikan pertanyaan? Yes, Pak. There was already a microphone over there.
Thank you, Paul. I have a question about how to measure, to assess what intrinsic cognitive load, extraneous cognitive load, and German cognitive load.
Great question. That is a question that cognitive load researchers continue to investigate. There are a number of questionnaires that have been developed over time. We might measure overall cognitive load. Do you remember the faces on the 1 to 5 scale that I showed earlier on? Oh, just one moment. So this admittedly measures overall cognitive load. Very, very simple. Your question is about measuring the more fine-grained measures. So for those purposes, and maybe for research purposes, there are some questionnaires developed by Jimmy Leppink, some German colleagues called Klepsch and Bannett. So I'm a little bit vague on these. So Klepsch is one, and there is another German scale that can be translated into English and other languages by Felix Kriegelstein. So if you would like to send me an email, I can send you some of those references. So I will admit that measuring cognitive load through self-report still has some there's a lot of debate about how it might best be done. So people go back and forth about whether we can actually measure it. So it's an active question. For educators, working in a classroom, how do you tell whether a student is experiencing high cognitive load? Well, I would suggest look at their faces, look at their expressions, maybe look at their body language, ask them. Interested teachers will figure out strategies for understanding. Sometimes, however, I will admit that students may pretend that they're understanding. And so maybe you look at just whether people can solve problems that you put into. If they can't solve a problem, then could be two reasons. A, motivational, they don't care. So cognitive load theory definitely depends on some level of motivation. But if they are motivated and they can't solve the problem, that would suggest high cognitive load. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. We know the cognitive load is intrinsic, extraneous, and German cognitive load. For intrinsic cognitive load and extraneous cognitive load, we can assess through the semantic differential like that. My question is, can we assess the German cognitive load through the test scores from the concept mastery of student, not through the semantic differential questionnaire?
Sure.
Thank you. That is my question. My research is so confused about how to assess the German cognitive load.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Paul.
Yeah. Some researchers say that we can assess it. So some of the German researchers who have developed these self-report questionnaires, they argue that we can. Other people argue that germane cognitive load is not separate to intrinsic cognitive load, that they are heavily related. So in my work, I tend to focus more on just the two-part model, so intrinsic and extraneous load, because effectively intrinsic load will cover, in my opinion, intrinsic load covers germane processing. So I don't I tend to follow John Sweller in this. I don't think that germane processing is a separate source of load. I think it is effectively the same as intrinsic cognitive load, but with the purpose of constructing new schemas. So it's a sort of a theoretical point rather than a measurement point, but I guess it has implications for measurement as well. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question or not, but it's, as I say, an ongoing sort of theoretical argument about, in the theory, about do we even need germane cognitive load as a separate construct. It's, you know, the change in title to germane processing suggests that it is not separate, that it is actually just a component of intrinsic cognitive load.
Paul, can we actually add that to measure that students have the opportunity to construct this new schema, we can assess it from giving them tests?
Yes.
And that test actually tells us whether they are able to manage their extraneous cognitive load in particular. So in such a way, they have the chance to construct the knowledge, which means they can manage to have a German cognitive load.
Yeah. So the question of what form of cognitive load people are experiencing is an important theoretical question. And it's not like we can sort of, you know, scan people's brains and identify, oh look, their extraneous cognitive load is high, or their intrinsic cognitive load is high, or they're using germane processing. Our measurement, the level of measurement doesn't work like that. So some people have argued that the most suitable way of making an argument about what type of load is being experienced is through careful theorising, through what Fred Pars has called task analysis, for considering what are we asking students to do, what sorts of processing is that likely to involve, and then looking at the task performance, as you say, or test performance, and seeing whether our hypotheses are supported. So a different way of thinking about the about hypothesis generation and testing, I suppose. Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions for him?
Okay.
Yes, Ibu.
Thank you. I want to ask the question about artificial intelligence, because I think cognitive load maybe in my opinion there is a relationship how to remain the higher concentration of students relate to the AI and relate to the how they progress in the cognitive load. When discussing cognitive load in the current educational context, why does cognitive load remain high even students are assisted by AI during learning? But someday they'll also show the bad feeling during learning task performance. But we know actually they can use AI to solve their problem.
Yes. So, yeah, it really is the big question of right now, isn't it? What is the role of AI and what roles might it play in terms of cognitive load? I'm going to give another plug for the work of my colleague Andrew Martin, who has been developing AI prompts in relation to load reduction instruction. So I will change these slides to include those, a link to those particular prompts. My concern with AI in education is what is called cognitive offloading. So the idea that students may use AI to do the work of learning for them. So remember I said earlier on that if we go into a learning situation like a classroom, and we are there for, let's say we're there for an hour, and then we leave, and long-term memory has not changed, we have no new schemas, fundamentally learning hasn't happened. If long-term memory doesn't change, then learning has not happened. That's the risk with overuse of AI, that students will give the task to an AI and then just copy and paste. And I think many of us have seen this. In my university, it has resulted in changes in assessment policy that we use. We use two different lanes of assessment. One is it can be used, no problem. You can use it, or if you don't want to, you don't use it. And another is just old-fashioned secure assessment, exams, or spoken word assessments. And that is how we ensure that people have the schemas encoded in their brain. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question or not, but what I don't want to say is that AI should not be used in education. That would be a bit silly of me to say. I think that with care and with the right prompts and systems, we can use it to help students learn effectively in dialogue. We can use it in a range of different ways that manage cognitive load appropriately, but we need to be sure that we are using it in those ways. I think that we, as a international educational community, are still learning about how to build AI systems that don't simply put all of the work onto the machine and then we just sit back and go, yeah, great, So yeah, I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but those are some thoughts that I've got. So again, I will change these slides to make sure that I point towards the load reduction instruction prompts. I think they could be very useful.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you. I'd like to add a little bit and what you think about what I'm thinking now. Cognitive load theory is focused on how to help us learning, not simply just solve a problem.
Yes.
We know that we can use AI to help us solving problems. For example, finding which errors in a document, for example, finding how identifying of features from a picture or diagram or something like that. AI helps us in our daily life, supporting us in finishing or completing our tasks maybe more efficiently now, which means we have more things to do then. But cognitive load theory is focused on how we can help somebody learn. So how we designed a learning material in such a way it helps learners to train their brain, to be able to step by step activating their schemas, and so they know how to solve a problem. I think by gaining strategy or how to solve a problems in our brain, it will help us later on when we use AI and then we find a trouble, then we know how to identify and solve the problems that we have in our daily life.
Yes.
What do you think?
I think so. I mean, for me, that comes back to the question of what knowledge does the learner have in their long-term memory to support and guide their own learning. Part of that is cognitive, but it sounds like part of it is also metacognitive. So just to explain that term, metacognition is thinking about thinking, so that sense that we have of our own thought processes, including our own learning processes. And so successful learners have a good sense of how they learn, suitable strategies for different circumstances, suitable strategies for different learning outcomes. And so one thing that I like to hear from my students concerning AI is that my students are not silly. They recognise the risks of using AI for their own learning. Many of them claim they don't use AI very much because, presumably, they are aware that if they overuse AI, it will harm their learning. It's really, it's very impressive, actually. I mean, believe me, there are certainly plenty of students who do use AI, who probably cheat. You know, I'll be realistic. That's an international problem. But I'm also hopeful that there are many students who want to be successful learners on their own. You know, and so what's the balance? I think we're figuring that out still. And we want, if we are going to use AI tutors, those tutors need to be designed to not just give people the answer, to use suitable strategies under certain circumstances.
It's a prayer call.
Yes.
Thank you, Paul, for thank you for the additional explanations. And well, now it's prayer callings, and it's time also for lunch. We have a break first, lunch break and prayer break, and then we return to this room for the second session at 1 p.m. I think, yeah. Thank you, and let's give a big applause to Paul. Kami persilakan Bapak Ibu untuk makan siang sudah disiapkan. Kemudian kita kembali sebelum pukul 1 di sini.
Terima kasih.